Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Exploring New Inroads into Clinical Trial Diversity. Where do we go from here? I'm Dr. OK Enya, Senior Policy Advisor at the Alliance for Health Policy, and have the privilege of working on the Alliance's Clinical Trial Diversity Project. For those who are not familiar with the Alliance, welcome. We are a nonpartisan not-for-profit that is dedicated to helping policymakers and the public better understand health policy, the roots of the nation's healthcare issues, and the trade-offs posed by various proposals for change. This is the final webinar in the Alliance's Clinical Trial Diversity Project mini-series. I've had the pleasure of speaking with and interviewing experts in this field over the past 6 months, and I am delighted to gather you all here today for a spirited discussion. This work is critically important because unless and until we can achieve full representational and proportional diversity in terms of clinical trials, we will continue to have the outcomes that we see in various contexts. As well, today's webinar is generously supported by Amgen, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, Walgreens, and Genentech. Thank you for your support of this program and for all that you do to support this very important work. You can follow the Alliance for Health Policy on LinkedIn to stay informed about upcoming events like this one. And you can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. And today's panel has a Q&A section at the end. We want you all to be active participants, so please get your questions ready. You should see a dashboard on the right side of your web browser that has a speech bubble icon with a question mark. You can use that speech bubble icon to submit questions you have for the panelists at any time. We will collect these and address them during the broadcast. Throughout the webinar, you can also chat about any technical issues that you may be experiencing, and someone will attempt to help. Now I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Gary Perkerin from the National Minority Equality Forum. Dr. Perkerin is the founding president and chief executive officer of the National Minority Equality Forum, a nonprofit healthcare research, education, and advocacy organization that is headquartered in Washington, D.C. The mission of NMQF is to reduce patient risk by assuring optimal care for all. NMQF conducts evidence-based, data-driven initiatives to eliminate premature death and preventable illnesses. NMQF's vision is an America health service research, delivery, and financing system whose operating principle is to reduce patient risk for amenable morbidity and mortality while improving quality of life. Dr. Perkerin also received his doctorate from Brown University. And I'm now going to pass the baton to Gary.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Anya, and thank you to the Alliance. You guys have really put together a fabulous panel today, and looking forward to the conversation. This issue about diversity in clinical trials is really at the heart of NMQF, because if we don't have good science, we can't have great healthcare. So this is really a really important conversation. And I'm going to start it off with our first panelist, Ricky Fairley. I'm going to ask her to introduce herself and tell us a little about the work that she's doing. So thank you so very much.
Thanks, Gary. It's great to see you, and great to be here today for this amazing conversation. You know, clinical trials is my passion, but I'll give you a little background on my story. And I'm in the breast cancer lane, and then talk about the work that we're doing towards getting more diversity in trials. So I had stage 3 triple negative breast cancer. I did all the things: surgery, mastectomy, chemo and radiation, and I was fine after a year, and almost a year to the day of my diagnosis. My triple negative breast cancer came back on my chest wall. My doctor said, "Okay, Ricky, you have 2 years to live. Get your affairs in order." And I said, "Well, I can't really die right now. I have a daughter at Dartmouth. I have to pay tuition. So me, you, and God, and some drugs or something, we've got to work this out." and I advocated for myself. And I found a doctor with the help of the Triple Negative Breast Cancer Foundation, who was probably about one of 5 docs in the country at the time actually doing triple negative research on Black women. And she put me on some drugs that were experimental at the time. They're now standard of care. And I did a lot more chemo, and I didn't die. And last week I had 12-year celebration as a survivor. So I'm very blessed to be here, but this is my God job. But the reason why I'm alive is because I took experimental drugs. And so it's so important to make clinical trials accessible to women with breast cancer. For breast cancer for Black women, we have devastating numbers. We have a 41% higher mortality rate than white women. We have a 39% higher recurrence rate than white women. We get triple negative breast cancer, the worst one, at 3 times the rate of white women, and we really don't know why. And the stat that makes me the most upset is that Black women under the age of 35 get breast cancer at twice the rate of white women and die at 3 times the rate, well before they would have that first mammogram at age 40. And so we need better science. What we're finding is that the treatments that we have are just not working. There's got to be something wrong with the science. And the only way we're going to get better science and better solutions for Black women is to do research and have them included in research. So a couple of years ago, we did a research study to really understand. I'm a marketing person by trade, and I wanted to understand what was in the heads of patients and what were they thinking. So we interviewed 300 Black breasties to understand what their perceptions of clinical trials were. And so what we learned was a couple of things. First of all, doctors do not invite Black women to clinical trials. So they're not invited, so they don't know about them. And more importantly, though, is there's this fear of the unknown. I think I'm going to get the sugar pill and die. I think I'm going to, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I don't want to get the placebo drug. And so we learned very quickly that they really just didn't understand how the science works. They didn't have an understanding of standard of care, that yes, you are going to get a drug, but you're not going to get a sugar pill in cancer research. And with simple explanations like, that Advil you took last week, it was in a clinical trial. That heart medicine I give my dog Harper, it was in a clinical trial. When you break down the science to them and explain it in simple terms and with words that they can spell, they say, sign me up. I want to do a trial. I don't want to die. I want to get better. And so we built this campaign based on the learnings from the research called When We Trial. And we launched our When We Trial movement a year ago. But it's really a social media and video campaign with videos of Black breasties talking about their clinical trial experience, talking about how the science works, talking about how science saved their lives in simple terms from the voice of trust, the voice of a breastie. And so as of yesterday, we've now signed up 12,868 Black women for clinical trial portals. We do that with our social media campaign, with our website, whenwetrial.org, and the video library on our website. But we also hit the street. I think by the end of October, we will have done 60 events across the country in 52 weeks, which is crazy. I don't sleep in my bed a lot. But what we learned is that going into the community and going where Black women live, work, play, pray, and slay, we can connect with them and talk to them and explain the science to them from breasty voices that they can trust in environments where they're not necessarily thinking about health. They're not thinking about cancer. And so we try to catch them off guard at hair shows, at Essence Festival, at the Urban League Convention, at all different kinds of events where they are just acting in their community and living their lives. And then we can explain it to them, because frankly, you need to really understand what a clinical trial is way before you need one, or way before someone in your family needs one. So we're trying to break down the science in easy words, in easy stories, that they can see hope and they can see the value of this diversity. We're also working with our pharma partners, and 2 of them are sponsors today. And we actually are launching right now a nurse navigator program. So we're working with Genentech and with CGen to basically, and a couple of other companies, to help them design their recruiting materials. Because if you look at the way even pharma's recruiting patients, I have to say their baby is ugly. They don't know how to talk to Black women in a way that's going to be effective and engage them. So we're helping them design the materials. We're helping them, break down what an informed consent looks like, so people can read it in letters and words they can explain and spell, and just help them understand it with their families. And then we're providing a nurse navigator to help them understand the trial, talk about, what the trial is going to be like for them, and then help them not only recruit for the trials, but then retain Black women in the trials. So we have a 24/7 available nurse navigator that's not part of the trial itself, but part, kind of a fairy godmother on the outside. She's a breastie and she's a nurse navigator who can help them get through the night when they're scared, can provide, just a hug and some love when they're worried about the trial, and then also explain the science and to help them through the trial. So we're hoping to expand that program, but we know that we're making an impact because we're seeing more Black women come into the trials, be interested in trials, and we just have to, to do more of it. And right now we're actually working with, we're trying to understand our numbers a little better because we want to be able to measure it better. Right now we have 3% participation of Black women in clinical trials for breast cancer, but we're not really sure what that number means. How many women is that? What is the absolute number that 3% represents? So we can see where our 12,868 compares to that. So we can figure out, what do we need to do better? What do we do more of to get more Black women into trials? But we know that the status quo isn't working. And I think that if you look around and really take a hard look as a patient at the materials that pharma companies are using to recruit people, you can see very easily that it doesn't work. And so we've got to do better. We've got to be iconic in how we think about it. I like to say that we're impatient about being iconic. We're going to not do what's always been done because we have to do it differently. So I know we're going to get into this conversation more, so I'm going to pass it on to my friend Craig Lipset. So Craig, you want to jump in here?
I'm delighted to jump in here, Ricky, but I was thinking that no one should have to follow Gary Puckering and Ricky Fairley on today's topic. The two of you teach the masterclass on today's topic, but it's my pleasure to be here and to get to share at least some perspective. So my name is Craig Lipset, and I co-chair a nonprofit collaboration called the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, DTRA. Let me see, I'm not sure if I have the power to click to advance the slides on my screen. Or can there we go. I can just wish it to be true. And there are a couple of the other affiliations that I have. I am on the faculty at Rutgers University and have a handful of other board roles. The views I'll share do represent my own. Next slide, please. So just a few opening perspectives, and just building on what Ricky had just shared, it's worth calling out the important guidance and policy that has taken place over the last year and a half of tremendous work of many of the people on this call and many of their colleagues. And as a result, today we do see the rise of diversity action plans being embedded into development programs, being encouraged through draft guidance as well as legislation. But on the next slide, I do want to temper some enthusiasm about this progress, that the concept of having a plan doesn't go far enough. And to call out that in the draft guidance, the note that's included here is that if the sponsor is not able to achieve the enrollment goals of this plan, that the action is to discuss a plan and justification for collecting data in the post-marketing setting. The bottom left is a picture of my grandmother, who used to tell me pretty frequently an adaptation of a classic proverb: a young girl plans and God laughs. We make plans. We make plans all the time. And those plans, some of them work and many of them don't. And so simply having the mandate of having a plan does not necessarily deliver diversity in our programs. In fact, one could speculate that the paragraph that I've copied here could set up a two-tier system of evidence. that our clinical trials continue to generate evidence among white enrolled participants, and that those people of color who are not included are simply addressed for evidence through post-marketing surveillance, use of real-world data, which on the continuum, on the hierarchy of evidence, is not the same level of evidence that we rely on for and are able to generate in a randomized trial. I think the hook that's left here for us today is that there are no incentives, there are no penalties. And we know that incredible progress has happened in drug development when we attach incentives or penalties. Rare disease drug development, pediatric drug development has matured incredibly because we've matured to that place. On the next slide, I also want to call out that there's been incredible progress both in the United States and globally around our ability to use decentralized research methods, decentralized approaches. And for those of you who may not be familiar, when we're talking about these decentralized approaches, all this really means is that we're creating opportunities for a visit to take place in a study outside of a traditional research site. We know that access remains an important barrier for many. Physical access, that research participation can be extremely burdensome, and that downstream of so many of the important areas that Ricky has spoken to around research and health literacy, around being invited to participate, that very often the next barrier for so many is simply being able to physically access the research site with the frequency that's required for many studies. Decentralized approaches help to break some of that connection of requiring me to be physically present at a site and instead letting me use video or home visits or connected devices, or maybe even have visits taking place in other locations more convenient to my home, like pharmacy as an example. And so as we think about more investigators in diverse communities, that can be an important solution for helping to enroll more diverse patients. We can think about decentralized strategies here to help improve access downstream in the process. But one thing I want to call out in that draft guidance on the next slide is something that I believe the regulators really should be acknowledged for. As I mentioned, these decentralized approaches can help with access. But in the draft guidance from the FDA from May on decentralized approaches, we see a call out on an additional role in research that regulators and most others in the research community have not really acknowledged. It's the role of the HCP, the healthcare provider, the person that a patient has another name for. They call that person my doctor. And in most cases, the person who is my doctor in my community is not an investigator in the trial that's right for me. And so we've long run into this quagmire that physicians in the community are not in a positive position to make referrals into research studies. In an RVU-based economy for healthcare in the United States, there are disincentives around losing patients, around losing visits with those patients. And so what we see in this draft guidance is an acknowledgement of that HCP in creating a role for them to be able to host visits and perform routine care activities during those visits in the study. Many study protocols involve some experimental procedures and other things that require specialized training, but there are other things in those study protocols that are more routine care activities, and those can be performed now by a healthcare provider who's already trained on those routine care procedures. This is new for us in the research community, and what this will start to do is open up some exciting new doors for us to include local physicians inside of diverse communities to be able to host visits without all of the burden and overhead, the responsibility and oversight of being the study investigator. And so we'll be able to open doors now by having high quality investigators, where those docs who've been investigators before, that know the responsibilities, procedures, and oversight, who can support visits taking place inside of more local community providers that are already known and trusted. And creating this new engagement is going to be yet another door for us to be able to open to unlock more equitable access to participation, because it's no longer a story that my doctor has to be an investigator in research in order for me to learn about a study from the person I trust for my care. Next slide. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have in a bit, and it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Fabian Sandoval.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or afternoon. So if you can hear me or see me, I think I've lost everyone. Let's see.
We can still hear you, Fabian.
Perfect. There, that was my camera that was not on. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon and talk to you a little bit about the importance of what we're doing at Emerson Clinical Research Institute to really push. We've been pushing and we will continue to push what it means to be kind of a leading site in the process of conducting clinical trials in this diverse communities that we have here in the DC metro area. We have been able to really kind of demystify what it is to conduct clinical trials, and we've been able to do that successfully because of the real footprint that we have in the community when it comes to working with underserved, supporting community activities, as have been mentioned earlier. Really, it's a one-on-one activity. Having the ability to see patients where they need to be seen, having our clinics in those neighborhoods, going to our outreach efforts that we do. We have very strong outreach efforts through our foundation. We had to start a foundation in order to have those doors opened to us, and that has allowed us a greater access to patient care. So we work with several consulates here in the DC metro area, and it seems a lot of people may want to try this. And my encouraging activities, yes, do it. It is quite hard to develop that trust, even within a government, to allow you to go into their facilities. And what we do is we talk about health in a very open manner. Instead of the patients just waiting there, or in this case, just people, they're not patients yet to us, we educate them. We educate them on a variety of health topics. We educate them on things that we might not even be doing work in our research institute for, but starting to develop that level of recognition that we are a trusted face has gone a long way. We've been doing this now for 10 years. And when we do this, we have put together this little triangle, triangle of support, where we have our foundation that is able to refer patients to our clinical research if needed, to our community clinic and any other community clinic that's available within the region. Sometimes people are coming to us not just from the DC metro area, it depends on which consulate. We have people from Delaware, Pennsylvania, West Virginia that come because this is where their closest consulate is. So we can't give them care here, so we will refer them to a different location. And then once again, our community clinic will do the same, either send a patient to a clinical trial opportunity or work within the foundation. As we have done that, part of the success is also our team, which is really dedicated to our patients by not working the standard work hours of 9 to 5. This is science, this is medicine, this is sometimes like almost little mini urgent care depending on the study, which means we have to be there early, stay late, and open on weekends. It may seem like something that people wouldn't do, and I've heard of sites not doing this, and I don't understand why. We open at 7 a.m., 6:30 a.m. We have to do house calls. We go to the patient's home to have samples prepared for us to bring back to the lab. It's going that extra step, and absolutely working on weekends, having a Saturday schedule as well, is what we need in order to be flexible and grateful for those patients who are participating in our research, because that gratitude is not just seen in the compensation that we provide patients, but being there for them at all times. I believe the work that we do and the impact and the safety that we provide our patients is verbal as well. We tell them, we don't care where you work. We don't care about your legal status. We don't care about your insurance status. We will help you no matter what. And this is a safe space. And as soon as we tell some of our community members that we don't care about their legal status, and we talk to them in a language that they understand, not just say in Spanish, but using the same colloquialisms that are familiar to the communities, really has opened up those doors. And then the last part is really what has become a driving force, and pretty proud to say the only force that we know of in clinical trials is a TV show, right? We started a TV show that airs in Telemundo, and it airs in the DC metro area, in Chicago, Dallas, Albuquerque, Salt Lake City, and now in Florida. We are in Orlando, and now we're moving to Tampa as well, where we have a half an hour real TV show that airs on Telemundo. Saturday mornings between, depends on where you are, either 10 a.m., 10:30, 11, 11:30, even one market has us at 1 a.m. because we know that's when the patients are watching. And this call is really another way where we're promoting health, where we're promoting access, awareness of care, and the importance of what clinical trials really is and what the benefits are. And I want you all to remember my tagline, which is clinical trials is a complement to medicine, right? If a patient's receiving primary care services and then they receive clinical research services, they're getting a lot more opportunity. We tell our patients some of these treatments are very expensive, and even if you were to have insurance, it's still not going to be covered because it's not out yet. The radiology procedures, even having some simple radiology procedures, is a great benefit for patients. In some of our patients, female patients, have never had a mammogram. And at that point, I don't care if you don't qualify, but screen with us. Screen to see if you would qualify for one of our studies. By the way, because it includes a mammogram, it includes a PAP, it includes a ultrasound, all the things that will promote proper health for a female patient. And the same thing when we do neurology studies. We do a lot of MRIs that are important for patients. So that has been a great way to educate patients through our TV show. We have 1.1 million viewers. We have projected 2.4 million because we're expanding our reach. And we're expanding our reach to continue to educate. And that is also thanks to the support of sponsors, right? We need local, we need government, we need pharmaceutical sponsors. And I know Genentech's on here as one of the sponsors of this mission. Genentech really saw the vision. Genentech pushed the idea of how can we help? They were my first sponsor. I'm not saying Genentech's the best, Genentech's the best. I'm just telling you that Genentech stepped up when other sponsors didn't and showed the value of what it is. So other sponsors that are here, other industry individuals see that, and we join forces. And now I've been blessed that we have over 9 pharmaceutical organizations that believe in what we're doing. And it's thanks to those efforts that we've been able to expand that. And now that's why I say 2.4 million households view the show and understand and call us for help, call us for support, because having the trust of the community in clinical trials is fundamental. And it is done very simply by demystifying, by taking away all those things that people may not understand, by speaking in terms that people will understand, and opening at times where patients can come. And lastly, provide transportation. If our patients can get to the clinics, they will come. They will come because sometimes it's too expensive. Just too expensive to park, it's too expensive to drive, tolls are expensive. So by providing them with a simple solution like transportation, I promise you it will continue to grow that level of trust, not just in what we do in clinical trials, but what we do in any areas of health and healthcare. It is fantastic that we're having this discussion. And now I am going to pass the baton to my next speaker, which I honestly don't remember who it was. But thank you for allowing me to be here this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sandoval. It's good to see you again. I know we've been in conversation and in partnership with your programming, and we're very proud to be part of that. Thank you to the Alliance for Health Policy for having us all here today to have this very important conversation. My name is Courtney Christian. I'm a Deputy Vice President at PhRMA, the trade association that represents over 30 of the leading biopharmaceutical companies who are committed to finding treatments and cures that allow patients to live longer. It's coming back to you, live longer and healthier, more productive lives. I also lead our equity initiative, which is really our industry commitment to diversity, to making sure that our industry is more equitable. It's across 3 pillars around advancing research and policies on health equity and closing health outcome gaps. It's about enhancing clinical trial diversity, the topic of our conversation here today, but it's also about how we build a diverse talent pipeline into our industry across the range of occupations and opportunities within our industry. And so, collectively, our companies have invested over $1 trillion since 2000 in the search for innovative treatments and cures, and really invested over $102 billion in just 2021 alone. These new therapies are ones that are changing the lives of people with chronic disease that are suffering from various forms of cancers and rare diseases. And so these new treatments really stand to help reduce the cost of excessive hospital readmissions and lifetime care costs. And they really illustrate this investment really illustrates the industry's commitment to prioritizing, patient care and developing and providing effective treatments. But as this conversation has pointed out, we know, and I know Dr. Puckrin is going to join us on this conversation later, that there are higher rates of chronic disease and cancers, as Ricky alluded to, in Black and Brown communities. And to be honest, we all know it's because of long-lasting effects of systemic racism and other barriers to care. We know that there have been, gaps in access to testing and treatments, and these were really pointed out and made more stark during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they've really underscored that really one of the most critical things we can do to improve health equity is to facilitate better access to healthcare screenings and use of life-saving medicines, and really getting more people of color into clinical trials. Because we know that medicines can play a really central role in lessening the burden of diseases that disproportionately fall on communities of color and other underserved populations. And so I think I'm so glad we're having this conversation today, because I think we all have to creatively work together across the healthcare continuum to solve for solutions that improve access to care. And we think at PhRMA that these solutions, of course, need to be patient-centric. We feel very strongly that the work that we are doing as an industry on clinical trial diversity will have a downstream effect of advancing health equity and closing gaps in health outcomes. Our companies have always tried to ensure diversity in clinical trials. We know that enhancing meaningful representation of diverse participants really provides information about drug response. It makes it possible to measure the safety and efficacy of medicines in populations that have been historically underrepresented and understudied. And we've been in a climate because of COVID-19 where the conversation around the importance of clinical trials, particularly within communities of color, has increased. There was a recent study that showed that 98% of Black voters say that tackling diseases like diabetes and hypertension and cancer with more diversified clinical trials is important to them. A few years ago, as at PhRMA, we held a clinical trial diversity workshop with hundreds of stakeholders to understand what the issue is, what are the issues surrounding access to a trial that patients see, and what's important to them as they are trying to access a trial. And number one reason we heard was historical and lived experiences, right? We heard about Tuskegee, we heard about experimentation on Black women, we heard about birth control experimentation on women in Puerto Rico. We just heard the range of lived experiences among people of color. And then we said, okay, we have to really acknowledge these lived experiences. They're very important. And we folded them into our first ever industry-wide clinical trial principles that went into effect in April 2022. And they focus on, three main areas that acknowledge those experiences, but also three main areas that we think will help our companies meet communities where they are to build toward greater representation. So the first of those principles is around building trust and acknowledging the past wrongs. You can't have a conversation about clinical trials without acknowledging all the reasons for medical mistrust within communities of color, and having that conversation and saying there are now protections that are in place, but recognizing again that there are present day issues that persist in people's interactions with the healthcare system. The second principle was around reducing barriers to clinical trial access. So thinking about things where sites are located and whether or not they're accessible. And then third, thinking about how we might use real world data to enhance information on diverse populations beyond product approval. So what we really want to see is more increased participation that we hope will breed more confidence in the data that's found in clinical trial research. And then we hope that in turn, that'll lead to better health outcomes. I have a mentor, and I know many of you know her, Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, who says patients, particularly patients of color, should demand a seat at the table. And I think you heard one of my fellow panelists say here, I think from Ricky, that particularly in communities of color, patients may not be asked to participate, or they may not have that access again, or what we've heard is a lot about in the literature about implicit bias on the part of providers, whether or not they even think about whether or not a patient is one that's optimal to participate in a trial. And so we just generally think as an industry that patients, deserve better, and that we can work together to help decrease this feeling among patients that they feel disenfranchised, they feel like the system is rigged against them. And they have high metrics on whether or not on feelings of discrimination within the healthcare system. We've heard a lot about why people participate in clinical trials, and we've heard some about the barriers from a sponsor perspective in terms of recruitment challenges, infrastructure challenges, the complexity of diversity in trials overall. Some about physicians and sites, the lack of physician referrals to sites, the limited diverse investigators, lack of technical support or connection to a network. And then, from a patient perspective, limited awareness of understanding clinical trials, limited access, and patient mistrust. And so what we've tried to do at Pharma to answer some of this is we have gone into partnership with Yale School of Medicine, with Morehouse School of Medicine, with a research coordinating center at minority institutions, which are HBCU institutions, and with Vanderbilt School of Medicine in a grant funded by Pharma called Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development. And it's really a community-wide, industry-wide, community-based effort focused on supporting sites and patients in underrepresented communities to enhance clinical trials diversity in a sustainable way. So 3 things that we want to come out of this project that we call EQB Med. We want to partner with trusted messengers like Dr. Sandoval and others, and Ricky and others, and community leaders to raise the education and awareness and support for clinical trial participation. We want to provide the resources and technical support for local sites to be successful and sustainable and thrive. So that means having things in language translations, having things at appropriate health literacy levels so people can understand the information, and then really building training opportunities and mentorship for investigators and staff. One thing that we heard early on in some focus groups was that from patients is that we don't see enough people who look like us. When we do participate, we don't see enough people who look like us. So having investigators and other staff who are part of this project is important to us to figure out how we pull that thread through to make sure that those faces, those familiar faces, are seen. So this is an 18-month project, and at the end of it, we hope to turn it into a more sustainable sort of model on clinical trial diversity and how our companies may carry clinical trial research on. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Clay Allspach, for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and great to be with you all today. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Clay Allspach. I work for Levitt Partners. We're a healthcare policy firm here in Washington, D.C. Before coming over to Levitt, I was the Chief Health Counsel of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where I had the opportunity to work on legislation, as I'll talk about, the Food and Drug Administration Safety Innovation Act, some other pieces of legislation that touched on this topic. And so really appreciate the opportunity to participate today. We'll say, in my experience, as we look at issues as significant and important as this, these opportunities to have this discussion are absolutely critical to making progress. And so just want to give credit to the Alliance for Health Policy and thank them for, and the sponsors for moving this forward. It's going to be critical because, as I'll talk about, what I'm going to do is kind of talk through where Congress and some of the agencies have been related to this topic and where it may go. As we'll talk about, there's progress that, as we all know and would stipulate, needs to continue to happen. And so, but these type of opportunities to have this discussion will be critical to making that progress. So thank you for that opportunity. If I could go to my next slide. Next one from there would be great. This is what I'll kind of cover, and don't worry, I will not, I will keep it short so we can get to some, I'm sure, some great questions that will be coming. But we want to talk about kind of Congress and FDA and that where they've been over the last decade or so. Also talk about the role of CMS. There has been legislation that has been enacted that would help in that regard with really the clinical trials. And then, as I mentioned, kind of go into where we go from here to make progress. So on the next slide, I will talk about the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act. So this is a piece of legislation. Some call it FDORA. When we worked on it, I had an opportunity to work on this legislation. It was the 2012 user fee. We thought it was going to be called FDOSIA, but what do we know? It's become FDORA, I think, in common parlance in FDA circles. But it really was a great opportunity to work with the agency for Congress to set a priority. Not that it wasn't a priority, but I think what you see in the relationship and the interaction between FDA and Congress is that Congress has, FDA has a number of different priorities that they can work on. And it's helpful to the leadership as well as to the rank and file there to understand, where Congress wants them to work and where the resources, other type of support will be provided. In the legislation, in the 2012 user fee, there was a provision that was related to basically clinical trial diversity, and it required this action plan from FDA related to what FDA was going to do on the subject, and that involved not only that plan, but also public meetings, other opportunities to basically to provide that leadership and to continue that effort to make progress. And what you'll see and what we'll kind of talk about, and we can talk about, is that the user fees are these every 5-year opportunity to not only is it seen to reauthorize the critical user fees that are funding the agency, but for stakeholders and for Congress, it's an opportunity to look at where we are on important subjects and to continue to see where this priority setting needs to happen. That's what happened in 2012. And so that's was one of that's not to say that it wasn't worked on before, but it was a huge priority as part of that. And then, as we'll see, and I'll talk about and we can go to the next slide, it has continued to be a vehicle where we do see continued work. So earlier, late last year, Congress was able to get done an omnibus, and included in that omnibus legislation was a reauthorization, a long-term reauthorization of the user fee. As we heard in the user fee discussion last Congress, the clinical trial diversity was a major priority for both parties, for both houses of Congress, so the House and the Senate. And the thought was, what more can happen? As much as the FDORA legislation enabled progress to happen, additional progress is necessary. So as Craig touched on earlier and others were touching on, there were requirements that were put forward as part of this legislation for sponsors on the drug side as well as the device side in terms of what they had to do with their applications as they move forward. One of those was a diversity action plan, where as part of their, in phase 3 in a drug world, they have to basically put forward how they're going to, what their goals are on diversity and how they're going to achieve those goals. So that was a major step. That is a requirement. That is a shall in statute that has to be there as part. It wasn't there before. And so that was a number as a big piece of it. In addition, there was a clinical trial diversity guidance that was issued before the enactment of this legislation. This legislation calls for an update of that so that additional information will be incorporated not only from the legislation, but lessons learned from the draft guidance that was put forward and the comments that were filed by the different stakeholders. So that is something that I think we can expect pretty soon in terms of next steps in terms of a draft guidance. There also is, as we saw in FDORA, we're seeing that in this legislation too, the call for public workshops. And so there actually is a public workshop, a meeting at FDA is going to hold on November, I believe it's 29th and 30th, where they're going to go through and talk with stakeholders and talk about clinical trial diversity and what more needs to happen, and have a conversation with stakeholders. Because as we see, not only in these type of fora that we're having today, but also importantly, bringing FDA in, bringing others in, those are the type of opportunities for the public dialogue where we can assess kind of where things are and where things need to go. So that was something that Congress required as part of it. Another part of the legislation that is really critical, and this was touched on earlier as well, so I won't go in deep, is that the role of decentralized clinical studies and clinical trials, where participating in clinical trials can be very difficult, especially as we're trying to get and ensure as diverse a set of folks participating as possible. And so the more that we can incorporate technology and other advancements to enable and reduce the burden, frankly, on patients and their caregivers, anything we can do in that regard is really helpful. And so there was a decentralized clinical studies guidance that was put forward that Craig talked about earlier that hopefully will help in that regard. So I think what you see here is, one thing I'll talk about in a couple slides is that, this is something that came forward from Congress. I think the hope is that continued oversight as well as dialogue with the agency will continue. It can't just happen every 5 years where another user fee is coming forward, so we're having that discussion. It's something that needs to happen continually, right, to better understand where things are and to ensure that as different requirements are being put forward, there's analysis on how those are going, whether it's working or not, and what more needs to be done or should be done in order to address a problem. On the next slide, we talk about CMS. So one of the things that was really important that happened a couple of years ago was basically Congress stepped forward with basically policy that would require basically any type of, for Medicaid, for state Medicaid programs, to cover any type of routine patient costs that are furnished in connection with a clinical trial. So this is something that was happening related to Medicare for a number of years, but it wasn't happening for Medicaid enrollees, which obviously is a big problem. And so Congress has did step forward, and this is another omnibus bill that was passed in 2020, basically to solve that problem. Where that is right now, CMS is working to educate states about this requirement. This went live on January 1st, 2022. So we'll just have to understand and ensure that as a policy community, just a community at large, that this is being enforced and actually being put forward, because we want to make sure that the most vulnerable out there are able to participate in trials and have everything. There's nothing that's standing in their way, or that we're cutting down as many barriers as possible for that to happen. On the next slide, it's more of a kind of where we may go from here. So one of the critical pieces, as I mentioned, is going to be the FDA implementation of those requirements that just passed a little under a year ago, are related to FDORA. Those are the diversity action plans. Those are the public meetings. That's the guidance. That's the other piece where FDA's implementation of that, and we know it's a big priority for FDA, will be absolutely very important. And hopefully Congress will continue its efforts to basically work with the agency and work with stakeholders to understand how this priority is being implemented and what we're seeing. But that will be something that we'll want to watch very closely. In addition to that, just watching the CMS and CMS's role as well. So whether it's the requirements related to Medicaid, Medicaid or others, their ability to influence, whether it's through payment rules or through their educational aspects, helping state Medicaid directors understand what their requirements are, is going to be absolutely critical. So that's something that continuing to work with CMS will be important. Another issue that I haven't necessarily touched on, but it will be important, is just related to funding and incentives from the federal government. So this can take a number of different, this can go in a number of different ways, but just understanding, just given the federal government's role with whether it's, can be funding community-based organizations or helping them get the funds to enable this to happen, or other aspects, I think is something to definitely further explore and what can happen in that regard. And then, but finally, just closing it out, helping clinical trial participants and their caregivers. So this could be decentralized, trials authority that's coming forward, or implementation that's coming forward from FDA. Just finding ways for them to help them, because we need to meet them where they are, and we need to go wherever they're situated to enable and help them. So looking for additional ideas in that regard, I think, is going to be absolutely critical. And so we'll just have to, further explore where we go from here, whether that's just to enable that to happen. So with that, I will turn it back over to Gary and look forward to the questions. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to give a couple of seconds for folks to respond to the poll before we move on. Okay, great. I'd like to pick up the conversation with Clay. I'm going to ask the other panelists if they don't mind turning their cameras on. Clay, you passed on some, I think, some really important information that we should take a moment to understand a little bit deeper, and that is really about the Medicaid program, and that the federal government. Can you give us a little deeper understanding about is this reimbursement for the trial itself, or for portions of the trial?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. Yeah, it's for the basically the costs that don't get picked up by the clinical trial. There's a lot of attendant costs that are associated with it. So the idea is to enable and help those those in the program to have those costs covered as well. So they're not bearing any type of expense that may be there.
So let me be provocative for half a second here. So there are these new multi-cancer early detection screenings that are coming out that are detecting cancers, 50 cancers at one time with the blood draw. They're able to identify patients at stage 1 and 2. One of the reasons why they've been slow to come to market is because of the concern that if someone gets diagnosed, they will not necessarily have access to care. And this is, I'm talking about in the trial now. So you've got an MSID trial. I'm not talking about a post-trial, but MSID trial, you pick up the signal that this particular person may have a possible cancer, and they have to get follow-up care. How would you interpret the law in that regard? Because that comes as a result of the trial itself.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean,
I love putting these questions to lawyers.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a great question, and it speaks to like a larger issue, right, about these trials and these tests and their ability to, frankly, help save money in the long term, because we're identifying earlier, especially instead of waiting for stage 4. We're identifying that earlier. But as part of those as part of those clinical trials, if they're in Medicaid, I would think those costs would be covered, and not the cost of the trial, but the other costs. And if somebody has cancer, absolutely, right? They need to be taken care of, and need to be treated. So I think that would come absolutely with it.
Gary, you're raising so many important topics here that you're planting seeds and opening the box around, right? That, as you mentioned, routine care expenses. When a patient is in a clinical trial, there are procedures that are study specific and unique, and there may be some things in a study protocol that look like routine care. And as Clay mentions, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, over the last 3 administrations, policy has been enacted that is meant to make sure that your public or private insurer is meant to cover those routine care activities. Now, for some patients, that may mean there are new out-of-pocket costs that they did not have prior to those policies being enacted. For some patients with high deductible health plans or with significant copays, they are now getting bills for those procedures that a pharmaceutical sponsor may have fully covered under their study budgets in years past. In addition, there may be denials of coverage that are left on the shoulders of patients and we've seen from Kaiser, right, 17% of claims can wind up in a denial of coverage. Where do those bills land? Fabian also mentioned earlier this notion about our ability to screen and the additional support we're providing patients from screening, just as you're asking in that question with Clay. But we need to make sure that if we are screening individuals and there are diagnostics, whether in screening or during the study, those same individuals may need other support to make sure they can access whatever care is needed downstream of those screening. I think one other seed I'll plant here, Gary, and I'd love to hear what others here have to say on the topic, is around for many patients in trials, there is compensation that's provided, meant to be fair for and equitable for their time. But in today's tax code, that fair and equitable compensation is taxed and does generate a 1099. And as a result, those individuals are not receiving the total dollar amount, but now that taxable income may affect their benefits that they may be relying on through other safety net programs, whether SNAP or other benefits programs. And so there are some important gaps that we have today that leave some participants with bills or other financial concerns that are addressable through policy.
I want to pick up on the tax question for 1 second, but I just want to pull through a little bit harder on this Medicaid provision, and I would assume it's also in the Medicare program as well, so that we're all at least have some level of clarity about this. So what I'm understanding is being said, patient comes into a trial, gets diagnosed with something that they didn't know they had prior to the trial. And as a consequence of that, either in the Medicare or Medicaid program, the program is going to treat them for that care. Am I reading that correctly? Am I saying it back correctly?
My understanding is not that those individuals have any additional coverage that they did not otherwise have.
Right. That's right.
The level of coverage they have is consistent with whatever they had without the clinical trial. If there's a diagnostic that's performed in the course of the trial, that then goes back to the individual coverage determinations between that patient and their payer. Clay, did I get that right?
I think that was exactly right. Absolutely.
Right. So who's left out is really the uninsured person, right? So if you bring an uninsured person into a clinical trial, what you then have is someone with no obligation to provide that care. Is that saying that correctly?
And then Gary, there's a big gap. There's a gigantic gap of those who want to and those who can, those who have access, those who are willing to step into that clinical trials participation because of the fear of these crazy bills. If they're uninsured, unfortunately, we see that quite a bit, and we've been able to kind of mitigate some of those damages on patients by helping them guide the system, but it's a big problem, and sometimes it's reasons why patients wouldn't look for care because they know it's so expensive.
Dr. Packard, if I could
Yeah,
jump in
please. Yeah, please. I'm
just to
sorry.
underscore this conversation around patient access and costs, because yes, there are, other costs that are incurred being in a clinical trial, but just when I talked about earlier about the entire healthcare system and just how insurance works in general, in terms of now we're in an era where so many patients are paying more for out-of-pocket costs, just period. You don't know where, drugs that medicines that you're taking currently, whether or not they're going to end up in the right formulary for you. So you've got, PBMs and other folks coming in between patients and their doctors and their care decisions. And then you are in a clinical trial and incurring other costs that the insurer may not cover as well, and other medicines that they may not cover as well. So I said it at the outset, and I really mean it, that it's really incumbent upon the entire healthcare system to kind of reimagine what healthcare looks like and to rethink our systems that and the way that they work now and the way that they are not working for truly patient-centric care.
Yeah.
Ricky,
I wanted to, there's a lot of people on this call that are part of this legislation, right? That can go back to their offices and really make a difference. Craig mentioned something that's been really on my new soapbox, which is really pushing this issue of taxing for patients who participate in clinical trials. It's unfair, to put it that way. It's unfair that these people are sacrificing their bodies to become research participants, and we look at it from that point, and then we tax them on it and say, thanks for being one of our patients, thanks for helping us improve the research, helping us move medicine forward, and now we're going to tax you on it. That's unfair. And those that are on this call, please take that back to your office. It's what I would consider a low-hanging fruit, if there is such a thing in politics, when we can actually make a difference and change the simple tax code that says $600 for a 1099. It should be zero. It should be exempt for anyone who's participating in clinical trials. I know, Ricky, I kind of took the floor from you, but I want to give you the baton back.
No, I hear you. I'm all about that. It's crazy. I was just going to add, another cost often is how the trial is administered. So if it's given in an infusion in your body, then it's covered by your hospital costs, and it's usually covered. But if you have to go to the drugstore and pick it up, then that's a whole nother cost to the patient that comes out of there, that may not be covered. So that also is an issue with all of chemo, all the drugs, but definitely in a trial that's, and frankly, Fabian, you're right. They shouldn't have to pay for anything. And I know that a lot of the trials will cover the cost of the drug and the cost of the treatments, but like your scans and kind of your routine tests and blood work has to be covered by the insurance that you already have. And if you don't have any, then that's a problem.
So a couple quick questions. So back on this tax issue, are they taxing for the value of the trial itself? What piece of it is taxable?
The patient compensation.
If the patient gets compensated, transportation, yeah, okay.
And keep in mind, we have R&D tax credits for.
Yeah, or the food card or the child care or all the things that the patient really needs to have to make the trial happen for them, right?
And we have lots of other instances where people who get paid for things don't get a 1099 or have tax implications. And we have an ecosystem that has provided tax credits for R&D for the common welfare of all. So this isn't such a stretch what Fabian and Ricky are speaking to here. I do want to call out, Gary, one thing that does work is and I want to make sure this isn't mixed in a negative way, if people are harmed in the context of a trial, if something adverse should happen, research sponsors do cover those individuals for any costs of something adverse happening in the context of participating. So people in those situations are protected. But as you're pointing out, some of the other downstream implications of the diagnostics that are performed are certainly left as a potential gap based on someone's insurance.
Great. So clearly there's a lot of policy stuff that we have to walk through. I was thinking back to Medicaid, for example, how does redetermination play in the middle of this? So you're in a trial, and given the way Medicaid works, you can get disenrolled before the trial is over. And what happens to you? Are you treated as an uninsured person at that moment, or are you grandfathered in? How does it, or we don't know the answer to that question?
The process today, Gary, is that pharmaceutical sponsors will do a coverage analysis together with, there are a couple of different groups out there that do this type of coverage analysis. They look at the schedule of events for the protocol and they compare it to an average Medicare patient, as an example. And based on that determination, they'll remove the costs from their budget with the research sites like Fabian's research site. So then the research site is left to go back and seek reimbursement for those procedures through the whether Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance of that individual patient. So it kind of puts the burden back on the research site like Fabian's to have to negotiate and navigate that. And if a patient winds up with a denial, it throws this burden on the investigator that now they have to deal with the patient that there's an unpaid bill.
So let me return to the heart of this panel, which is, so where do we go from here, right? Let's give everyone a chance to, from their own lens, talk about. So you got a blank sheet. We're going into the future. What's the next step here? Clay threw some stuff out on the policy side, but I'd love to hear others weigh in here. Where do you think we need to go as a system to get to this diversity? Courtney, you want to start us?
Sure. Sorry, I was trying to find my mute button. I think where we're trying to start from is what I talked about a little bit earlier with our project on EQB Med, equitable breakthroughs in medicine development. What we're trying to get away from as an industry is what we've done historically, and I think Ricky alluded to this earlier, where we kind of go into a space and set up shop for a trial and leave, and we take all those resources with us. And what we want to do with EQB Med is really think about what it means when we go into a community and stay, when we bring access to that trial to the community. Is there a local HBCU? Is there some other local facility that can be used? Who are the providers in that community? Who are the family practitioners? Who are the internists? Who are the pharmacists in the area that have these connections with people in the community to be able to have the conversation about, hey, there's a trial that's happening down the road. I live here in DC at Howard, and it's on breast cancer. And, do you have a history of that in your family? How has that impacted your family? Here's some information about it. And here's a number to call the community resource nearby to get you to that trial, to help you get there, for transportation, to help you understand what that trial is about, what the science of that trial is, what it is that trial is hoping to find. And so we want to really turn that into a more sustainable model of clinical trial, and trying to make sure that people from different backgrounds from all communities are seen in the research, but also to make sure that the medicines that we are creating, have efficacy for that particular community and what they need, and what they're looking for in a medicine to treat their condition. And so we're hoping, that's a new world of doing something different that our companies, haven't quite done before, and really making the investment to meet patients right where they are.
I want to ask Ricky to dial in and talk about it from the patient's lens. So where do we go from here from the patient side of the ledger?
So I know I can do a lot of things, but the one thing that I'm really good at is educating Black women. And so that's why I focus my energy. I'm not going to be able to change racism. I'm not going to be able to change illicit bias. I'm not going to be able to change health insurance. But what I can do is teach Black women to demand trials as part of their standard of care treatment. that frankly, if you're 38 years old and you get triple negative breast cancer, you need to be in a clinical trial. And I'm not a doctor, I just play one on Facebook, but you need to have that as part of your treatment plan. It should be common conversation. It should be, and we're not going to get asked for them, so we have to demand them. And we say, doctor, hold on, what is my best treatment option, and what clinical trial is included in that conversation, and demand the care. So that's why I can be powerful, and that's where I can teach women and educate them to advocate for themselves and stand up and say, I need to understand this. I need to make this clear. You know, I need to have a clinical trial as one of my options to consider. And you know, Gary, I don't know if you've heard me tell this story before, but my ideal world, if I had a lot of money, I would build a clinical trial facility in every Black neighborhood. And it would be this beautiful Victorian house where you walk down the street, you open the wrought iron gate, you walk up to the porch, the beautiful Black grandmother gives you a hug. She takes your 3 kids into the playroom, feeds them spaghetti. She takes you into the treatment room and gives you a blanket that she crocheted, a cup of tea with mint from her garden. She turns on Luther Vandross and she gives you the shot. So to me, we've got to make these environments comfortable and caring. And you know, it's about science, but it's also about love. That tumor in somebody's body is connected to a life, to a lot of lives. And I think we have to think about the impact on the life of that patient. And you know, it's not about just the science that we're doing, and clearly we need to advance the science, but you're also holding someone's life in your hands. You're holding someone's grandmother in your hands. You're predicting someone whether they're going to have a next birthday or see a grandchild born or go to a wedding. And so I think we have to do this with care and love. And it's about you know, changing a life. And I think we lose that in these conversations about taxes and health insurance and whatever, but it's really about giving people the best care they can. And we're not going to get to health equity until we all practice the golden rule. What your mother taught you when you were 2 years old. Treat others as you want to be treated. And so when you think about clinical trials, think about what you'd be doing for your mama or your auntie or your grandma or your daughter. How would you want them to be treated? And I think if we all thought about it in terms of giving care, we'd have a different conversation. And I know our work with Genentech, we love them so much because they're giving us license to help them. Hey, my baby is ugly. We're going to do it differently. And we're going to bring the care into this conversation. So we're so grateful for that. But that's what I'm going to keep pushing for, and teaching Black women to say, hold on, take your hand off that door. I'm not done with talking to you yet, doctor. Give me the information I need to make an educated decision about my best care.
And how do you deal with the trust issue, right? Because the Victorian house ain't in the community, right? It's a beautiful dream, but it ain't there. So you're dealing with folks that long histories of distrust. How do you handle it?
I know it's great. And you know what we found though, Gary? We found that when you educate, the mistrust is based on a lack of knowledge. And our research shows that they think they're going to get the sugar pill and die. But when you break down the science and explain what standard of care is, all that Henry Lax conversation goes out the window, because you're saying you're going to get a drug and you're going to have the best treatment options. And when you explain it to them from a voice of a breastie, like a voice of trust, you know, me and my core of women, it's a different conversation. And so it's really about educating them and helping them understand this is how it works. You're going to get the best care possible. It's like Advil. And now my latest thing is, do you have an iPhone 15? Guess what? It was in a clinical trial. I mean, think about everything that we do was tested in some way. And if you explain it to them in simple words they can spell, they want to sign up because they want to live. And so I've had many conversations with many women, and I can convince you to do a trial in 5 minutes with just, here's the deal, girlfriend. Save your life.
I think the issue of trust too, Gary, is about recognizing people's lived experiences right now. Yeah. You know, one of our colleagues at Genentech, actually, the chief DEI officer, Quita Highsmith, she tells a story that during COVID-19, she was asked to participate in a trial. And she did all the things that she needed to do to be able to participate in the trial. And but ultimately she was turned away from the trial. And when she called to say, hey, I really want to participate in the trial, why am I being turned away? They said, oh, we don't really need you. But they didn't have anybody of color in the trial. And so she really pressed her way, through to say, no, you do need me, and this is why you need me. And so there are experiences like that are everyday occurrences, but it's also just the everyday, Ricky, I think you're talking about just everyday lived experiences of trying to access care. What does this hospital bill mean? I don't understand what a deductible is. And just those moments where we have to rise to meet the moment to help patients understand how to navigate their own care and empower them to ask those questions that you're saying, Ricky, to empower them to say to the doctor, no, you're not leaving. I'm not getting a 15-minute appointment here. We need to talk about my issues, and we need to talk about them more broadly because it's going to take longer than 15 minutes. So I think that's kind of some of the ways, and it starts with medical school education, I think, and the thread pulled through all the sciences of just trying to figure out how you have those conversations in an authentic way and make people feel like you actually care about their healthcare outcomes and to care about them as well.
Let me ask Dr. Sandoval to talk to us from the clinician's lens. So here you are, you've got a blank piece of paper here, and you're going to write the future of clinical trials from the clinician's perspective. Where would you start? What would you think? Yeah.
I already filled out my blank piece of paper as we were talking. So there's a lot, right? So first of all, the sponsors are trying to do their best, right? And we do have, right, from our side, I do see Genentech, I do see Pharma, Janssen, BMS, GSK, UCB, several of these big pharma companies who are trying to do something and making a difference. But what do I see here is that's important that we need to make this change is Ricky, you mentioned something, and Courtney, you mentioned it again with this implicit bias, right? It's not implicit, it's purposeful, right? And we do it and not realize it, and we do it and we do realize, well, you know what? You're kind of dressed a particular way. You kind of smell when you walk into my exam room. You smell like gas. You smell like grass. You're full of paint. You're not dressed properly. You didn't shower. You're not going to be in my study. I'm not even going to bother asking you. That's racism. 100%. Ricky, you said you can't fight it. We absolutely can, and it's just talking about it, putting it in, and bringing it to people's attention. Why didn't you? That's a racist activity. It's not implicit. It's not unconscious. It's purposeful.
Yeah. Or you've got 3 kids and you're a single mom, and you don't have a job. Whatever. I hear you. I think that it's really it's a hard one though, because it's hard to get women who, if that's your normal, you know what I mean? You don't even realize it, right?
And it is fixable, right? It is fixable on the sense of having the young folks come through, right? Having it in medical schools, reinforced in medical schools, Gary. So that's the first thing we need to do is get rid of that. My dream is to have a national educational campaign. And it can be a very kind of grassroots program where we educate and we remind people of the complement of medicine, like I mentioned to you in the past, and to those legislators that will hear us, is to remind them that a healthy, an educated patient is a healthy patient. That's my other buzzword that I have, my other phrase, because a healthy patient who's educated will do better. And then if we're looking at it from an economic standpoint, that means there's still more people in the workforce. That means there's more money to be had in the work that we do. That means there's less patients going to the emergency room. That means the economy balances out. What happened during COVID? We got flooded with patients that needed help. And then because of that, the economy was tanking, right? We didn't have the resources available. People were getting burnt out because of this. So having that ability to have more access, and if you think about it this way, it's the same thing I tell my patients. Listen, you think it's cheap to be in this study? You think it's expensive? Wait till you don't have a job because you're that sick and you can't go to work and your bills are going to pile up. Become part of this study. Let us help you, and we will do the best so that you stay working, so that you can give your family the money that you need to survive, and not just here, but I know that you also have to send back money to your own countries. So having that in place, right? And then the last thing is the community engagement, is the work that we do besides the national campaign, is doing grassroots work where we go to the communities and we talk to them all the time. Pharma companies are now seeing the value of including within their budgets community outreach, right? Community outreach is very important because that's where we're going to get to those patients. And pharma companies realizing that just because a patient does not speak English does not make them a vulnerable person, right? Vulnerable does not mean not speaking your language. You can have a neurosurgeon that's sitting in the consulate that doesn't speak English. That doesn't make him vulnerable, it just doesn't mean he doesn't speak English. And that's a regulation that we need to remind everyone of, right? The Code of Federal Regulations talks about some of these things and give patients the respect that we all deserve, right? I never walk around saying I'm Dr. Fabian, I'm just Fabian. It doesn't matter who I am. We all treat ourselves as equals. And if we have that equality, when someone talks to me about a clinical trials, Ricky, like you're mentioning, that goes a long way. So having the community engagement, having that ability to talk to people where they are, and then bringing down the cost within the economy is really going to make a difference. So there's a lot of food for thought in my statements that could really have impacts on what we're doing in legislation now.
Great. Ricky, I want to bring Craig in. He talked a little bit about decentralized clinical trials and the value in having trials everywhere. You know, one of the things that I want you to think about as we talk about clinical trials is that they're also a business, right? And that we want to make sure that we're not just taking value out of the community, that we're also putting value into the community, that we're building infrastructure in these communities, because the fact that they're not clinical trial infrastructures in there can also be translated that they're not businesses that are doing clinical trials. So think about that a little bit. And again, you got the blank piece of paper. Talk to us about how do you bring these clinical trials into these communities, understanding that you want to do two things. Obviously, you want to get them folks into the trials, but you also want to make sure that you're bringing value back to the larger community.
You know, Gary, my blank piece of paper has two themes on it: engagement and alignment. And those just sound like lofty words, but it summarizes so much of what I'm hearing here this afternoon. Engagement in the communities, engagement in terms of listening and talking, as well as educating and bringing knowledge to empower both patients, but also those treating physicians that those patients trust. As Ricky mentioned earlier, so many patients saying that they're just not being invited. There's a selection bias that's taking place in the minds of so many, whether investigators or other providers in the process. But this theme of alignment and dare I say, kind of freakonomics, and alignment including therefore economic incentives for those treating physicians, which we can start to chip away at, because in that decentralized draft guidance now, we see this doorway open to engage with healthcare providers in the community, no longer just showing up to take patients from their practices and ask them to refer them away, but creating these windows where those providers can have a patient in a trial, but keep ownership, keep supporting procedures for those individuals, which brings revenue into their practices and keeps them sustainable. We talked about the financial toxicity that can face so many people when they're participating in a trial, some of which we can address, most of which we can address through policy. These are self-imposed and addressable, whether around the tax code, as Fabian was mentioning, or some other gaps created around the use of coverage, whether through Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance that may leave individuals exposed. And, you know, maybe we can even be aspirational here. We know that aligned economic incentives have fixed rare disease research. They've fixed pediatric drug development. When we create carrots for industry, carrots could mean extensions of exclusivity or otherwise. We've seen how industry and their allies can work together to address some of the hardest challenges in drug development. And perhaps there are some carrots out there that could create alignment, that could incentivize these big challenges around diversity and representation into being addressed.
So Clay, one of the things that certainly we at NMGF have come to realize is that policy is part of medicine. It is a branch of medicine now. People may not appreciate that, but when you go into your doctor's office, there are a whole lot of other folks coming into the office with you. that are unseen and unspoken, but they're setting the rules, right? So how can we rethink? You've got the blank piece of paper now from a policy lens. How do we build this clinical trial infrastructure into these communities that heretofore that are not in here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of the, you know, align myself with all the ideas that have been put forward. I think the incentives piece is really critical. We're providing help for the providers in the communities, as well as the education and for the patients in those communities and their caregivers. That's going to be absolutely critical and necessary, because it's tough just to make it's tough out there, and we need to provide and help for them, just so that they can enable this to happen. And I think the education piece is really just really appreciate Ricky's comments around what she was articulating in her direct conversations. I think that is a piece of this, because as I look at it, it's like there's multiple things we have to do, and they may increase somebody's willingness to participate by 1% or 2%, but that's how we're going to build to where we need to be. And I think all these ideas that are coming forward will enable that to happen. But I think the policy world, as we were talking about, has a really important role here. I think one thing it's really important is to make sure that Congress and then the administration officials know, and I think they know this, but is to help them understand you're not done. Like there's a lot more we need to do, and to put these forward to say, let's go. Like here's some ideas that are ripe, that are ready, that can enable further progress to happen. And so just appreciate the opportunity today just to be part of this. Some great ideas, and really encouraged by kind of where things may be going.
Can I add one more thing, Gary?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh. Also, I think, the FDA has this diversity plan mandate now, so that when you apply, put your trial up, you have to give a diversity plan. And I've talked to a few people from them a few times about, okay, so you can write a plan, but if you don't know how to do it, what are you doing differently? And I think there has to be some direction around what those plans look like. Like I know my When We Trial works. I know it works. I've recruited 12,000 women in a year. So if there's something that works, everybody should do it. I mean, I think when you talked about Fabian having a national plan, use our stuff, whenwetrial.org. It's all free. The videos are there. I mean, because it's proven that it works now. But I think that's where maybe even the FDA can play a more active role. And how are you measuring those plans? How are you actually evaluating those plans? If you haven't had anything that worked in the past, what's going to be different now? And I think, scrutinizing that, and I'm trying to have those conversations with the FDA too, like what do the plans look like, and how are you even building metrics around their effectiveness? And I think we all have to play a role there as we, kind of challenge pharma to put these plans together. But if stuff is working, like there's stuff that's working around the country, the Just Ask program, there's a few things that are working to recruit people. So use them, leverage them, take advantage of that.
I think one of the, as we come to the close out of this, one of the things that I've always thought about and kind of never figured out why it never gets to be part of the conversation. So one of the most costly things in drug development is recruiting for clinical trials, right? It's both the time and the risk of recruiting folks into clinical trials. And the point I'm making is, if you want to lower the price of drugs, fix clinical trials. It's not that crazy, right? If you really want to be serious about fixing the cost of drugs, take the risk out of the business. Part of drug development is risk, and so there is an opportunity for risk reduction here that translates into saving money. And I'm baffled. Janet Woodcock, she often talked about the insanity of our clinical trial system. That when you go to a company, they set up a clinical trial, for a particular drug, and then when the drug disappears, they walk away from the community, they walk away from the researcher. That is no way to fly an airplane. And so I think the underlying message that has come out of this meeting, at least my takeaway, was we need a national system. We need a real plan. We have to think through all of the problems of taxes, of reimbursement, of educating patients, helping the consumer understand. You're never doing that as a one-off. It's, you're going to waste a lot of money, but you're never going to get there as a one-off. And I think there's something to be said for policy, that there's got to be a policy solution for us. So I'm going to turn this back to the Alliance, and really, what a fabulous panel you put together, really thoughtful. And I hope those who were in attendance get the same value out of it that I did. It's really a great conversation. So thanking all the panelists. And okay, I'm turning it back to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, Gary, Ricky, Craig, Fabian, Courtney, and Clay, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take the time to complete the brief evaluation survey that you will receive immediately after the broadcast ends, as well as via email later today. We have many public webinars and in-person events throughout this year. Follow our LinkedIn or visit our website for the upcoming webinar on domestic violence on October 18th. We are also hosting our annual dinner on November 15th, and please let us know if you are interested in learning more about sponsorship opportunities. A recording of this webinar and additional materials will be available on the Alliance website. This concludes today's webinar, Exploring New Inroads into Clinical Trial Diversity. Where do we go from here? Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Great talking to you. Be blessed. Check your breasts.